Arrogant bikers surround a family at a rest stop. The dad's response stuns everyone. The rest stop was quiet, the kind of place where travelers refueled their cars and stretched their legs before heading back onto the highway. The dim glow of fluorescent lights flickered above the gas pumps, the small convenience store sat almost empty, and the hum of distant traffic on the highway was the only sound breaking the stillness. A man parked his SUV near the entrance. He moved with deliberate ease, stepping out of the driver's seat while his wife unbuckled their children in the back. His eyes scanned the parking lot, not out of paranoia, but habit. He was always aware of his surroundings. His wife, Emma, held their youngest child's hand as they approached the entrance to the store. The older one, a boy of about 10, trailed behind, rubbing his sleepy eyes. It was meant to be a quick stop, just a restroom break, a snack, and back on the road. They had been driving for hours. But then, the air changed. A low, guttural rumble filled the parking lot, growing louder by the second. A pack of motorcycles roared into the lot, their exhaust pipes screaming through the quiet night. They didn't park like ordinary travelers. They took over. Their bikes spread out, blocking multiple spaces. They didn't care. The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and a leather vest covered in patches, stepped off his bike with the arrogance of someone who had never been challenged. His crew followed suit, loud and brash, their boots clanking against the pavement. They laughed loudly, shoving each other, already acting as if the place belonged to them. The father glanced at them once, then looked away. He didn't react, didn't tense, didn't give them any acknowledgement. But his wife sensed the shift immediately. She held onto their son's hand just a little tighter. The bikers noticed the family. One of them, a wiry man with a smirk permanently etched onto his face, nudged his friend. "Well, well. Look what we got here." Another one chuckled. "Nice family trip. Bet you didn't expect company like us." The leader took a slow step forward, eyes locked onto the father. "Hey, buddy. You lost. You don't look like the type that stops at places like this." The father didn't answer immediately. He finished adjusting his watch, then looked up. His expression was unreadable. Emma inhaled sharply. She had seen that look before. The bikers waited for a reaction. A flinch. A sign of discomfort. But there was nothing. One of the bikers whistled. "Damn, man, you always this quiet, or are you just scared?" A few of them laughed, but there was something off. The father's lack of reaction didn't sit right with them. Usually, when they pulled this act, someone either got angry or tried to back away. But this guy? He just stood there. The leader narrowed his eyes. He took another step closer, standing just inside the father's space, testing him. "I asked you a question." Still, nothing. The leader smirked. "That's what I thought. You're smart to keep your mouth shut." He turned to his crew. "This guy knows what's good for him." The father exhaled, almost like he was bored. Then he checked his watch again. "You should move." Silence. The bikers blinked. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Calm. Unbothered. The leader frowned. "What?" The father met his eyes. "Your bikes. Move them. While you can." The laughter stopped. The air shifted again, but this time, it wasn't because of the bikers. It was because of him. The leader's smirk faltered for just a second. The father didn't look angry. He didn't look scared. He just looked ready. And for the first time, the bikers weren't sure what they had just walked into. The leader of the bikers tilted his head, eyes narrowing as he studied the father. The man hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened them. Yet, something in his tone had stripped away the easy arrogance the bikers carried like armor. There was no fear in his stance, no hesitation in his words. He simply told them to move. Like it was a fact. Like it was inevitable. The rest of the gang caught onto the shift in energy, though none of them acknowledged it out loud. Instead, they covered their discomfort with bravado. One of them, a heavily tattooed man with a scar down his cheek, stepped forward. "You got a death wish, old man?" His voice was playful, but there was an edge to it, something forced. The father turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him without breaking eye contact with the leader. "Not today." Scarface scoffed, shaking his head. "You believe this guy?" He looked around at his crew, waiting for laughter, but it wasn't as loud this time. Emma could feel the tension climbing. Her heart pounded, but she knew better than to say anything. She had seen her husband in situations before, never quite like this, but similar enough to know he wasn't going to back down. The leader exhaled through his nose, an amused smirk curling the edge of his lips. "You think you're some kind of tough guy?" He gestured to the group behind him. "You're outnumbered. You're standing here with your wife, your kids, in the middle of nowhere, and you think we're gonna back down because you told us to?" The father finally blinked. "No," he said evenly. "I think you're gonna back down because deep down, you already know you should." A quiet chuckle spread through the group, but it was different now. Less confident. More nervous. The bikers weren't used to this kind of response. They were used to men who got defensive, who tried to puff up their chests and meet aggression with aggression. This man wasn't playing the same game. One of the younger bikers, a wiry guy with too much energy, sneered and took a step forward. "You're just full of yourself, aren't you?" His hand hovered near his belt, just barely brushing against the chain hanging from his jeans. A subtle threat. The father finally turned his full attention to him. His posture didn't change. His face didn't shift. But the way he looked at him, calculated, assessing, made the younger man freeze. The father tilted his head slightly. "That what you want to do?" The younger biker didn't answer right away. He was still locked in the father's gaze, and something about it unnerved him. The leader stepped in, clearing his throat. All right. He grinned, but it wasn't as easy as before. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're just having a little fun, aren't we?" The bikers muttered in agreement, nodding, but their enthusiasm had dulled. The father exhaled slowly, then checked his watch again. "Move the bikes." The leader held his smirk, but it was just for show now. He wasn't used to this feeling. He wasn't used to being the one who hesitated. Emma gripped the kids a little tighter, but she could see it happening, the moment when the bikers realized they might have made a mistake. One of them nudged his friend. "Dude, who is this guy?" The leader heard it too. And the fact that one of his own men was starting to question the situation made something flash behind his eyes. The father didn't say another word. He just waited. The leader clenched his jaw. For the first time tonight, he was the one forced to make a decision. The leader clenched his jaw, his smirk faltering just for a second before he masked it with amusement. He didn't like this. He didn't like the way his own men were looking at him, waiting for his next move. He was supposed to be in control, the one calling the shots. But now, the power had shifted. And it wasn't because this man had raised his fists or threatened them. No, it was something worse. It was doubt. He could feel it creeping through his crew, spreading like a slow infection. And it all came from the father. The man hadn't moved an inch. His posture was loose, almost relaxed, but there was something in the way he carried himself that made the leader's instincts scream at him to rethink his choices. That feeling, the one you get when you're about to step into a fight you already lost. The father watched him, calm, unreadable. "Move the bikes," he said again. His voice didn't waver. Didn't rise. It was just a statement. Like the outcome was already decided. Scarface shifted uncomfortably. "Boss," his voice was lower now, hesitant. "Maybe we should." The leader shot him a sharp glare. "Shut up." His authority cracked as he said it. Scarface had never questioned him before. But now, with just a few words and an unshakable stare, this stranger had done something even rival gangs hadn't managed. He had planted doubt in his own men. The leader exhaled sharply, trying to regain control. "You think you can walk in here, play tough guy, and we'll just back down?" He took a step closer, squaring his shoulders. "You got no idea who you're messing with." The father tilted his head slightly, as if considering that. And then, finally, for the first time, he smiled. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't forced. It was knowing. A slow, almost imperceptible shift of his weight, a slight turn of his stance, small details that only someone who knew how to fight would recognize. The leader's breath hitched, just for a second. He recognized those movements. Military. Special training. Someone who's fought before. The realization hit him like a brick. He glanced at his men. They were starting to realize it too. One of the younger bikers, the same one who had been the first to challenge the father, took a small step back. It was barely noticeable, but the leader saw it. And it infuriated him. He couldn't let this happen. He had spent years building his reputation, proving he was the one people feared, the one no one dared challenge. And now, some random guy in a button-up shirt was tearing it all down without even throwing a punch. No. No, he wasn't going to let that happen. The leader's eyes darkened, and he suddenly lunged forward. But before he could even finish his movement, the father moved. Fast. Too fast. In one seamless motion, he sidestepped, grabbing the leader's arm and twisting it at an angle that sent a sharp jolt of pain shooting through his shoulder. The leader grunted in shock. His knees buckled for a split second as the father's grip held firm, not too hard, not aggressive, but absolute. The bikers froze. They had seen fights before. Brutal ones. They had seen men brawl, throw wild punches, take hits and keep going. This was different. This was controlled. Precise. The father didn't punch, didn't kick, didn't even raise his voice. He just held. And that made it so much worse. Because it wasn't about power. It was about control. The leader gritted his teeth, trying to twist free. But the more he struggled, the worse it got. The father leaned in slightly. "You should have walked away." A cold shiver ran down the leader's spine. The bikers didn't move. For the first time since they arrived, the rest stop was silent. No one knew what would happen next. Not even the leader. And for the first time in years, he was scared. The leader's breath hitched. His body tensed, his instincts screaming at him that he had made a mistake. The father's grip wasn't just strong, it was trained. Every small movement applied just the right amount of pressure, enough to let him know that if he pushed the wrong way, something would snap. The bikers stood frozen, their arrogance evaporating in the cold night air. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were the ones who intimidated people. They were the ones who walked into places and owned the room. But now, their leader was locked in a hold so effortlessly executed that it sent a chilling message: they had messed with the wrong man. Scarface swallowed hard. He had seen fights before, but this wasn't a fight. This was control. This was discipline. And it was over before it even began. The leader gritted his teeth, refusing to show fear. "You're making a big mistake," he growled, his voice strained. The father barely reacted. If anything, he looked bored. "No," he said calmly. "You already made it." The leader tensed, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The slightest motion sent a sharp warning up his arm. If he struggled, the father would have no choice but to finish what he started. And the leader wasn't sure he'd walk away from that. The father let out a slow breath, then, just as effortlessly as he had taken control, he released him. The leader stumbled back a step, rolling his shoulder and masking the discomfort with a forced smirk. His ego wouldn't let him show pain, but his pride had just taken a blow so hard it nearly knocked the air from his lungs. The bikers shifted uneasily. Their leader had just been handled like an amateur. And the father? He still looked unimpressed. Emma stood by the car, holding their kids close, her eyes darting between the bikers and her husband. She had always known there was more to him than he let on. But this was something else. Scarface took a step back, glancing between the leader and the father, uncertain. He had never seen his boss hesitate before. The leader forced a laugh, but it lacked the confidence it had before. "All right," he muttered, shaking out his arm. "You got a couple of tricks up your sleeve." The father didn't answer. The leader's smirk twitched. "But you're outnumbered." Silence. The bikers wanted to believe that gave them the upper hand. But the way the father stood there, unshaken, hands still loose at his sides, made them question everything. Scarface hesitated again. He looked at the leader. "Boss?" The leader didn't respond right away. He was staring at the father, trying to size him up, trying to figure out what the hell he was dealing with. Then, it clicked. His eyes narrowed, a realization dawning on him. This wasn't just some random guy. His stance. His control. The way he never once flinched. The leader had seen that before. Not in a bar fight. Not in street brawls. In soldiers. His stomach twisted. The father must have seen the flicker of recognition in his face because that was when he finally spoke again. "You still think you've got numbers?" His voice was calm, almost amused. The leader clenched his jaw. The father tilted his head, watching him. Waiting. And for the first time all night, the leader had nothing to say. The leader's smirk had vanished. His posture shifted, shoulders tightening, feet adjusting slightly, weight balanced, a subtle change, but the father noticed. He wasn't playing anymore. The bikers were still trying to figure out what was happening. Their boss had never backed down from a fight before. Never hesitated. Never let someone else hold the power. But now, they could see it. He wasn't sure. Scarface opened his mouth, hesitated, then finally muttered, "Boss?" The leader didn't answer. His focus was locked on the father. He was thinking. Calculating. He knew the type of man standing in front of him. He had met men like this before, not in bars, not in back alleys, but in places where fights weren't just about ego. Where losing meant you didn't get back up. The father didn't move. Didn't blink. Just watched. Emma's grip on the kids tightened. She didn't know exactly what her husband was capable of, but she knew one thing for certain: he never escalated a situation unless he already knew the outcome. The leader let out a slow breath through his nose, flexing his fingers. He had to salvage control. "You think you're special?" His voice was lower now, measured. He was testing the waters, looking for a crack. The father's head tilted slightly, as if the question was so ridiculous it wasn't worth answering. That reaction alone sent another wave of unease through the bikers. The leader squared his jaw. He couldn't walk away looking weak, but he also couldn't afford to push this man too far. There were rules in fights. Unspoken, but understood. This man wasn't a brawler. He was something else. Something worse. Scarface shifted again. He wasn't the smartest in the crew, but he could feel it now. This wasn't about winning a fight. It was about surviving a mistake. The leader exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He forced a chuckle, but everyone knew it was forced. All right. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot." The tension didn't break. The father didn't respond. The leader shrugged, glancing back at his crew. "Come on, boys. Let's not waste our night on some wannabe tough guy." Scarface was the first to move. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even look back. He just walked toward his bike. The others followed, though not as quickly, still processing what had just happened. The leader was the last to step back. He lingered for a second longer, eyes still locked onto the father, looking for something, anything, to convince himself he hadn't just lost. He found nothing. The father simply stood there, waiting. And that was worse than any threat he could have given. The leader let out a slow breath and turned. "Let's go." Engines roared to life. One by one, the bikers mounted their bikes, revving the engines louder than necessary, as if the noise could somehow reclaim the dominance they had just lost. The leader climbed onto his own bike. He didn't look back. And then, with a final deafening growl of their engines, they were gone. Silence settled over the rest stop. The father watched them disappear into the night. Then, finally, he exhaled. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to him, eyes still wide with questions she wasn't sure how to ask. The kids looked up at their father, their innocent minds not fully understanding what had happened, but knowing something had changed. The father glanced at them, then at Emma. He offered a small, reassuring smile. "Let's go," he said simply. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, it seemed that way. The roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. The father stood still, his shoulders relaxed, his face unreadable. The air was different now, quiet but charged. Emma could still feel the tension in her chest, even though the danger had passed. The kids were silent, watching their father, sensing that something had happened even if they didn't understand what. The older one, a boy of about 10, finally spoke. "Dad, were you gonna fight them?" His voice was small, unsure. The father turned to him, his expression softening just a fraction. "No," he said simply. "I didn't have to." Emma exhaled, rubbing her arms. "They could have hurt you," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "They could have." "They didn't," the father interrupted, his tone even. Not dismissive, but final. As if there was never a doubt in his mind about the outcome. Emma stared at him. She had always known he could handle himself. She had seen glimpses of it over the years, the way he carried himself, the way he assessed a room the second they walked in. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. Always. But this was different. He hadn't just stood up to them. He had controlled them. Without raising a fist. Without shouting. Without fear. She studied him, but he didn't offer an explanation. He never did. The boy frowned. "But how did you know they'd leave?" The father met his son's gaze, silent for a moment. Then he crouched down, "So they were eye level." "Because," he said, "I know men like them." The boy's brow furrowed. "Bad men?" The father hesitated, then shook his head. "Scared men." The boy tilted his head. "They didn't look scared." "They were," the father said simply. Emma swallowed. She had seen it too, in the way the leader hesitated, in the way his crew shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other when they realized they weren't in control anymore. It hadn't been the father's size or strength that had shaken them. It was his certainty. The boy was still thinking. "But why? There were more of them than you." The father nodded. "That's why they were scared." The boy frowned. He didn't understand. Not fully. Not yet. The father reached out, ruffling his hair. "Come on," he said. "It's late." Emma let out another slow breath, shaking off the lingering tension. She guided the kids back toward the SUV, her thoughts still racing. She had always trusted him, but now she realized she had never really known the full extent of what he was capable of. As they climbed into the car, she glanced at him again. He started the engine, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, scanning the lot one last time. He was always watching. Always aware. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered, who had he been before all of this? The father drove onto the highway, merging smoothly into the open road. The kids settled in, their fear already fading, their minds shifting to sleep. But Emma? She sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, questions swirling in her mind. The father said nothing. But he knew. He always knew. And as the rest stop disappeared behind them, he let out a slow breath. Tonight, he had handled things without blood. But not every night had been like this. The highway stretched ahead, dark and endless, the white lines blurring as the SUV moved forward. Inside the car, the tension had settled, but it hadn't disappeared. Emma sat quietly, her fingers drumming lightly against her knee, stealing glances at her husband. She had always known there was something different about him. Something beneath the surface. He was a good man, a good father, but there was a part of him he never talked about. A part she had just seen flicker to life at that rest stop. She cleared her throat. "Were you ever afraid?" The father kept his eyes on the road. "No." A simple answer. Too simple. Emma frowned. "Not even for us." His hands tightened slightly on the wheel, just for a second. "No," he said again. "Because I knew how it would end." She shook her head, exhaling. "I don't understand." He finally glanced at her. They were bullies. And bullies only push until they feel something push back. They wanted control. The second they realized they didn't have it, they left. She studied him, waiting. And if they hadn't? His jaw twitched. For the first time tonight, he hesitated. The answer was there, but he didn't say it. Because he didn't have to. Emma swallowed. She knew. The SUV rumbled down the road, the hum of the tires filling the silence. In the back seat, their son stirred, his voice groggy. "Dad?" The father glanced in the rearview mirror. "Yeah." The boy hesitated. "Who were you before?" Emma turned her head, watching as her husband processed the question. His grip on the wheel remained steady, his face unreadable. But something in his expression flickered, something distant. He took a breath. "Someone else." The boy blinked, waiting for more, but no explanation came. He frowned, but sleep was already pulling him back under. Within moments, he was out again, his soft breathing filling the car. Emma continued to watch her husband, her thoughts racing. He had let those bikers walk away. Not because he was scared. Not because he wasn't capable. Because he had nothing to prove. That scared her more than anything. Because it meant that whatever he had done before, he had already proved it once. The road stretched on, endless and quiet. The father drove, his face calm, his mind elsewhere. Somewhere only he could go. Somewhere he had promised never to return.